Hi, Greg Dunn here for CG Tuts, and you're watching Introduction to Blender Fluids. Today we're going to cover the basics of how you set up a fluid simulation inside of Blender. Go ahead and start Blender if you haven't already. Real quick, I'm going to change a couple of preferences that help the way that I work and might help you as well. Go ahead and move the mouse up so you get the double arrows or the hand, and click and drag that down. We're going to change the way that it rotates so that it rotates like a turntable rather than the trackball. Change auto perspective. This is the key if you're not interested in the other ones. This is the only one you really need to change. That's very useful for the fluid simulations. And as the pop-up tells you, it changes between orthographic. Basically it switches to the orthographic view so you don't have the perspective distortion when you're looking at the top, front, or side, and then change it so that we orbit around the selection. The other thing I'm going to change is the smooth view. That just makes it a little bit nicer when you use the number pad keys, such as 1 for a front view, 3 for a side view, and go back to 7 for the top view. Just gives that little bit of animation in there that sometimes can help you keep up. So go ahead and click and drag that back up. We're going to go ahead and use the existing box as part of our simulation, but we need to add a couple more things. Go ahead and hit the space bar, add mesh, icosphere, and it's going to put it right where this little object is. That's the cursor. If you left click somewhere, it will move the cursor to that position, and that's where it will create the next thing you tell it to. If you create a light or camera or whatever, it's going to put it on that cursor. For now, we're going to go ahead and leave it where it is. If you want to confirm that your object is there, you can just hit Z on the keyboard to go into wireframe mode to toggle wireframe back and forth, and so we see it. I'm going to go ahead and hit 1 on the keypad, move into the front view, zoom out a little bit with my mouse wheel, click and drag that up. I click this just to constrain to that axis, and that looks good. It's right over the cube, which is what we want. Now we need to add one more cube. Go ahead and hit the spacebar again, add mesh cube, and it creates it and automatically selects it. I'm going to hit S on the keyboard, as in scale. Scale that up a little bit, drag it up a little bit. This is what we call the fluid domain. I'm going to go into wireframe mode here. For any fluid simulation, you really only need 2 objects. You need a fluid object, which is what our sphere is going to be, and you need a domain. The domain is what the fluid moves around inside, and when it hits the edges of this domain, it's going to stop moving outward and splash up just like it hit a wall. Typically for a fluid simulation, you're also going to want to have some kind of an obstacle to make it more interesting. That's what this is going to be in a few minutes. For now, we're going to go ahead and, now that we've got our 3 primary objects, we're going to go ahead and add them into the fluid simulation. I'm going to hit F7 twice to go to object and the physics buttons. If you hit it one time too many, you can just hit it a couple more times and get back to it. We're going to go ahead and take our sphere and say this is part of the fluid simulation and we want it to be fluid. And so it's going to turn this sphere into fluid, and that's it. We're going to go ahead and leave all that at default settings. Right click to select our cube that's going to be our domain, and pick fluid and domain. And then we're going to right click our last cube and say fluid obstacle. We're going to right click again on our domain. It's key that you keep track of this object. Right now it's a big square. As we toggle back we can see, but as soon as I hit the bake button, this object is going to take on the shape of the fluid itself. Let's go ahead and try that with what we've got, just with all the default settings, and you see our sphere turns into a fluid blob. It hits the object, it falls, it splatters. Great. Congratulations, you just did your first fluid simulation. I'm going to hit Alt-A on the keyboard to play our animation back, and it plays okay, but it's really slow. What you want to do typically is adjust your time. And this is the simulation time of the last Blender frame. This one took me a while to figure out. By default, if we hit F10, we can see that we've got 250 frames here. That's just what Blender starts with. I'm going to hit F7 to go back to my fluid panel. If this was at 10, that would be 10 seconds. So the whole animation lasts 10 seconds. And so you've got 250 frames, you've got 25 frames per second. If we do this and hit bake, it's going to be way too fast. Let's see, now we're on frame 2 and 3. And it's already hit the floor and splattered. If I hit escape to stop the simulation and then Alt A to run it, it's just almost instantaneous. Typically what I like to do is change this to 1 or 2 or 3, and that seems to give a good reasonable speed with it set here at 2. Let's go ahead and try that. And it falls, it hits, it drops, it splatters. And hit Alt A, play it back. It's looking pretty good. Also, I'm going to go ahead and hit Z to come back out of wireframe mode now. And what you'll notice is that we don't have the big cube surrounding everything because it's taken on that fluid shape. I'm going to go ahead and make a couple more changes now. I'm going to hit S to scale our obstacle a little bit bigger, and then left click to confirm. And I'm going to hit S again to scale it, but I'm going to hit Z so that I can constrain it into just the Z axis to make it kind of a small flat box. Now I'm going to right click again on my fluid object. You've got to make sure that you've got the fluid object selected. If you right click on this, then you're actually dealing with the fluid itself rather than the domain, which has now become the fluid object. At this point, let's go ahead and add one more view so that we can scrub through the frames. I'm going to move my mouse over here to the edge so I get the double arrows, right click and split area about like that. Then I'm going to click on this button and pick the action editor. What this does is kind of gives you a timeline that you can scrub through. You see it's falling through. That's because we haven't rebaked this yet. But now you see sometimes it's easier to go a few frames up to distinguish between your fluid object and your fluid domain object. This is kind of our putting our fluid into the scene. So let's go ahead and bake this one more time since we've made this a little bit larger. And it falls, it hits, it splatters. Alright, we're going to hit escape and go back, see how it looks. And that looks pretty reasonable. Now we're going to talk about what we've got over here, the display quality. And we see that it looks okay, but it doesn't look great. One of the things that you can do to change that is change your display quality. The button on this side is how it's displayed in the GUI, and the button on this side is how it's rendered. So it starts out preview mode over here, final mode over here. Let's go ahead and change this to final so we can see, zoom in a little bit, we can actually see what's coming out. And that gives us a very different picture. If we just zoom back and play that, that looks very different than the preview. I'll just go ahead and bake that. It hits, it splatters, great. We play it back, we see it. If we change this to final, then we're going to see what is actually happening in the fluid simulation rather than the low resolution preview that we were looking at. And you can see there's a lot more detail there. If we just click that back to preview and final, you can see how much difference there is. It's really good to do preview mode in the viewport for a while. Once you start getting into more complex simulations, sometimes you'll want to use preview mode just so it plays faster. Other times you'll probably want to switch that back to final so that you can actually see what it's going to look like. The next thing we're going to do, let's go ahead and start changing some things up with our fluid object itself. Rather than just being a set bit of fluid, we're going to change the initial velocity. What this does is it gives it an initial velocity, like if we say, you don't want to make these numbers too terribly big. we'll make it say 1.4 in the X. I'm going to right click again to make sure I've got my fluid domain selected, and then hit bake. You won't see that bake button if you don't have the fluid domain selected. And what it does, if we hit escape and go over, it just sent that fluid splattering against the outer edges of the domain. The way we can tell that, if we didn't know already, with your domain object selected, you just hit the tab button and you can see that takes you into edit mode, and you can see that, oh yeah, sure enough, that's why we're getting that, because we're hitting the edge of the domain. The other thing I'm going to tell you about now is go ahead and hit tab again to take your fluid domain. If you want to make changes to the fluid domain after you've created it, do not scale it in object mode. You want to hit tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to hit A to select none. A selects all, selects none. Go into face mode, right click here to pick this face, scale that up a little bit higher, and then go back out, and I'll show you why in just a second. You know what, let's go ahead and scale the whole thing up just a little bit. So I hit A twice, scale it up just a hair. And now let's go into wireframe mode, looking at it from the side, the front, the top, and I think I want to turn everything off, scale this back down just a bit. Now I'm going to hit A, select everything again, move it up like that. Again, it's really important that you do all this in edit mode. It tells you right there, edit mode, not object mode, because if you scale your domain object in object mode, you will have problems. You'll probably have to delete it, delete your domain object, and start over. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to take this, move it down a little bit more, and I'm going to change it into an inflow. Go ahead and change that back to 0. Inflow means basically like you're turning on a water faucet or something. So this is no longer just a single sphere of fluid. It's now going to be fluid coming in the shape and scale of this sphere. If we go ahead and pick our domain object with this new inflow object and we hit bake, let's see what that looks like. That's going to come out, it's going to pour out. So now we have fluid coming from this object, and nothing too impressive right there. But if we change the velocity, let's say we were going to change it to around 2 in the z positive direction, which is going to be up this direction, and then we bake, it's going to get much more interesting. Now we have fluid shooting up from it, hitting the top, splattering out, spreading out everywhere, because again, we no longer have just a sphere of fluid. Now the sphere's size is determining the inflow of fluid into the simulator. So now I'm going to hit escape to stop simulation. I'm going to hit Z to go back into wireframe mode just to check things out. Scroll back a little bit and hit A to run the simulator. And we can see it just hitting and splattering everywhere. And so now it's getting a little more interesting. Let's go ahead and keep working with it and right click to make sure that I've got my fluid object as opposed to my fluid domain selected. Drag the fluid object up, and we've still got this Z inflow. We're going to change that back so it's coming down instead. We don't want it too crazy, so I'm going to just give it a little bit of direction as well, so that if this is the x-axis and we're going negative x, it should go that way. So we want to move this over this way. Pick domain object again, and let's bake. Give it just a second. Alright, and now it's coming negative z, negative x. So now it's coming, it's hitting, it's flowing around, it's coming out pretty nice. Now you'll notice that we're simulating with the final display quality on. You can do that if it's important to see the end result, as it'll be important to see that at some point in the project. Where at just depends on when. If we go back to preview, it's already calculating the preview mode, even though we haven't selected that. So it just is a matter of your hardware and stuff. If you've got really good hardware, you can just leave it in final mode all the time. So now we're getting a little more interesting. Our cube isn't doing much yet, so let's go ahead and scale it up a little bit and go ahead and move this up so we see exactly where it's going, but we also see the edges of where we're hitting the domain, and we can confirm that if we right click on our fluid object, hit tab, we see that. Let's go ahead and scale this back down, move that out of the way, though we can tell, okay, that's exactly where I want it to be hitting. Gonna go ahead and hit tab. We're still in face mode, so I'm going to pick this top face. I'm going to hit E to extrude, and then I'm going to middle mouse click to confirm my selection without touching anything else. And that's going to copy that face and leave it in the same place. S to scale, and scale it a little bit, and I'm going to hit E to extrude once more, and left click this time to confirm because I didn't want the default. If you want the default, you middle mouse to confirm, otherwise you left click to confirm. So now we've got a very simple box, and let's go ahead and make it a little more interesting. I'm going to shift click these four corners, raise it up just a hair. That'll be more interesting. Alright, so now we know that we're going to pour fluid right into this box, and again it's coming out because we haven't rebaked the solution. Let's go ahead and do that. Right click here, bake again. Now you see it's pouring up over the sides, it's splashing everywhere. Let's go ahead and change it up a little bit more. I think everything is good here. We don't want to get the velocity too crazy. What we want to do now is, so we see it, we preview the final, got that. Let's go ahead and make everything just a little bit bigger. Take our obstacle, scale that up a little, move it down a little bit. Our fluid should still flow in there pretty nicely. We're going to need to make our domain bigger though. Go ahead and hit tab, and well, we don't need to make it too much bigger. I'm going to right click on that middle face to select it, scale it down. Doesn't matter if our obstacle is poking through the bottom, that just means we'll have good solid collision on the bottom. Go ahead and one more time select our fluid domain and bake. Alright, we've let it run for just a couple minutes, and it's flowing in there pretty nicely. You hit Alt A just to play it. It fills up nice. Now, some of you are probably thinking, man, that is way too globby. That looks like slime or something. That doesn't really look much like fluid. Of course, if we go into preview mode, that helps a little bit, but it still doesn't help a lot. It still looks pretty big and globby. What we need to do now is crank up the resolution on these. Resolution is kind of like if you've got a box that's divided into 50 segments on all sides, and the X, Y, and Z, that's how much it's got to check each of those for fluid collisions and things like that. For the final mode, 25 for the preview. That's sort of what it's like. So if we crank resolution up to say 90, then you're going to see something very, very different. We'll go ahead and leave it in final and pick our object and bake. What you're going to see now is a much more refined fluid object as it hits and splashes, it looks a whole heck of a lot more like fluid than what we had a few minutes ago. It's much more subtle in the waves and the splashes and things like that. We'll let this run for just a minute and come back to it. Alright, let's go ahead and hit escape to stop the simulation and Alt-A to play. Now we see we've got a much more refined fluid simulation going on than we had before. What you can also do, if you go back into preview mode, you might notice you say, wow, that looks really bad and doesn't seem very representative of what I had at all when I go into final mode. But what you can do, you can crank up the preview resolution a little bit, so you'll get something that is still simulating at a high degree of simulation, but your preview is just going to look a little bit better. Let's go ahead and bake that for just a minute. Now you'll notice that we're still on preview mode in the GUI, but it still looks more refined than it did earlier. You still see smaller ripples, things like that. We're just going to get a better idea now of what the final is going to look like, and this is going to help us for animation purposes. We'll go ahead and stop that and rewind it and play it back, and you'll see that looks a lot better than it did. And what you'll notice too is that we're still in preview mode. If we go back to final, it looks even more refined, and you've got something a lot nicer than you had before. But you might still be saying, well, yeah, but it still doesn't look all that great. And you're right. What we can do, really, let's crank the resolution down a little bit. We don't need it as high as it is, because the next thing I'm going to show you makes a big difference as well in reducing some of the poor look and feel of it. Now, do a couple of different things. We're going to hit F9 on the keyboard so that we can go ahead and assign a material to it. You can pick a color if you'd like, if you want it red, if you want it green. Also, we're going to set smooth. It's going to turn on smoothing, which is going to help. Let's go ahead and turn it back off for a second so that I can show you the other feature. Go to F7, back to our fluids. Here in the advanced options, the domain options, this is what we want, be in the domain boundary options. We're going to crank up the surface subdivision and the surface smoothing to say 3 and 5, and that's just, I've worked with it some, I've tested it, and that seems to be a pretty reasonable resolution. Now let's go ahead and bake it again. Now remember, we crank this down a little bit, so in theory it should be less smooth than it was. Don't freak out if you see the big box like that. If you notice the frame up here, it said it was at frame -1. It does that sometimes. It pops that on there just to kind of reset itself and start the fluid simulation over. So now, even though we're at a lower resolution than we just were, it already looks a lot smoother, and we still have the smoothing off. So now we're really getting into something that looks a lot more like fluid, albeit nasty green fluid. We'll just let that run for a minute. Go ahead and hit escape. It's starting to move pretty slow because we've got a very well defined mesh in there at this point. If we look through the camera, hit F12 to render, that's kind of what we've gotten. And now if we go and set smooth into F9, it'll be even more. Big shadow here from the default lighting. fix that. Just add a second lamp over here on this side. Hit 0 to go back to the camera. F12. And now we've got some green slime filling in the box, climbing up the wall. The last thing I'm going to show you real briefly is, let's go ahead and hit F7 to go back to our fluid panel. So that's where the magic happens. Let's go ahead and crank this back down a little bit more, just for the sake of expedience. And I'm going to go back to my fluid object, my fluid inflow object, and show you one last trick. Let's say at frame 10, after frame 10, we want it to go away. I'm going to hit I to insert a key for scale. I'm going to hit the right arrow to move up to frame 11, which it tells me there and there. Now we're on frame 11. Going to hit N on the keyboard to bring up the transform properties, the numeric editor, and just change the scale of this to 0, 0, and 0. And now you see it went away. And now I'm going to hit I and insert another key for scale. What that's going to do is frame 10 it's there, frame 11 it's gone. And by scaling it down to nothing, that removes it from the fluid simulation. That removes the inflow, so you won't have any more fluid coming out after that. So let's go ahead and try this. Go ahead and bake. I'm going to go ahead and hit escape, go back and change these parameters back to 1 and 1 while you're still working with your fluid simulator and testing your simulation. You really don't want those numbers to be too terribly high. One other quick tip, well, one other thing you can do to help speed things up is make sure your domain is not too terribly big, because again it has to go through and calculate all the space inside that domain if this domain was split up into a lot of little pieces. So the larger it is, the more memory it's going to take up, and the longer it'll take. If you've got a domain that was way out here, the simulation would take longer because it has more space to check and calculate. I'm going to Z to go back into shaded mode, and one last time grab this and bake. Alright, and it's just about to go away. We're at 8, 9, frame 10, not there anymore. Let it run for just a minute. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and stop it here by hitting escape, and we've got something a lot more interesting. We hit Alt A to run it, and we see it flows in, sloshes around. So that is your introduction to Blender Fluids. There's a lot more I could have covered. Hopefully we'll do that in a future video if there's interest, but for now I think you've got enough to get started. So hey, let's see what you can do. Again, I'm Greg Dunn for CG Tuts, and you just watched Introduction to Blender Fluids. Thanks a lot.